Namaste. I've always had trouble with this gospel. And at the same time, I've always been kind of interested in how it gets portrayed in movies. But we'll get to that in a minute. The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck is a book about which you should not give a fuck. I'm a member of a nonfiction book club, and yesterday we met to discuss the book. And the agreement was pretty much that he could have condensed it into a 20-page book or maybe a TED Talk. But the core point is important. And the core point, I think, is where a lot of us, including me, get hung up sometimes. And that is when we don't quite realize that there's only so many things we can really care about before we start burning ourselves out. When we get all wrapped up in a whole lot of stuff that in the end isn't really that big a deal, like the gas station attendant, back in the days with the little change belt clicker thing, giving you, 5 nickels instead of a quarter. I mean, okay, it's, unpleasant, maybe obnoxious. Is it worth ruining your day over? I think most people would look back on it and say, well, no, there were a lot worse things that happened to me today. And, one of the things I've taken to saying to people who sort of over-apologize for some nothing, like me having to wait 30 seconds before they could help me somewhere, I just say to them, if that's the worst thing that happens to me today, it's going to be a pretty good day. So don't worry about it. And then a closely related idea is the one that's in that second reading of A Hill Worth Dying On, which I first heard that phrase, a ditch worth dying in. And I kind of liked it better that way. And the circumstances, without revealing too much of who's who, is that I was at a parish before I was ordained, and I had sort of become the host with the most, because we were going through changes of clergy and a long period of interim clergy, and they brought this guy in to sort of have a trial run for the vestry, for the church board. So there was a small service that he did, and I assisted him at the altar. And, afterwards, the senior warden, who's the president of the church board, asked me what I thought. I said, he's terrible. I said, all he does is talk about himself. He's an egomaniac. I think he's a really bad choice. I think we need to look at this real closely. He said, that's not a ditch I'm ready to die in. And now, I found out, like about 10 years after that it came out that he was having a long-term affair with somebody at work that his wife then found out about and divorced him. And maybe the reason he wasn't willing to die in that ditch was that somebody had something on him and it was going to come out. I can't think of any other reason why in that position you wouldn't at least raise somebody's concerns, especially since they sent me in to serve this mass as a spy. They told me, come and tell us what you think. And I think, too, the more common maybe experience around that is raising kids, especially teenagers. You just sooner or later figure out that every battle is not worth fighting. That there are some things for your own sanity you just have to let go. I think that happens at work sometimes, where something comes up and I know I can feel myself getting sucked in, and I have to stop and say, wait a minute, is this a ditch I want to die in? Is where you want to really throw in all your chips? And sometimes the answer is yes. But most of the time, I find anyway, that my initial tendency to want to save everybody and everything is not the best choice. And that brings me to this dinner. The real problem, and I only found this out a few years ago reading a commentary, with Herod marrying his brother's wife, is that she hadn't bothered, they believe, to divorce Philip when Herod married her. So not only it wasn't just that he was marrying his ex-sister-in-law, no, he was marrying his current sister-in-law, which, as you can imagine, would make family dinners just a little bit awkward.
Because the Jewish practice was that if your brother was deceased,
You should, yeah. But apparently Herodias didn't have much patience for that. And whenever I've seen this dancing business portrayed in a movie, it's sort of like, of course, depending on how old the movie is, it's a very tame sort of thing, but it's a very provocative dance. This isn't Herodias, doing her interpretation of Swan Lake or the Nutcracker.
like the ballet recital of the 6-year-old.
Right, walking on her toes. And although even if it was, Aaron has a friend who has a daughter who at 5 or 6 she took to see some ballet, and this little girl is precocious, outspoken, but I think she might be also a tad autistic. But the dancers came out for the beginning of the ballet, and she said quite loudly, "Oh no, if they're going to be dancing in their brawls and underwear, we're going to have to go." so, maybe it was that. But isn't it a little awkward? Let's suppose that Herodias' daughter is a stripper wannabe and gyrates out there, and Herod finds her dancing provocative. That always has left me a little bit uncomfortable. And then the fact that he promises her anything she wants up to half his kingdom. And she says the head of John the Baptist, after consulting with her mother. And Herod is thinking that if he goes back on his promise, his guests will be upset. But if he lops somebody's head off, they'll be fine with that. It's just, it's an interesting ethical dilemma. And then there's the whole...
Is it possible that he knows how the request came? So it's actually Herodias, his wife, that he doesn't want to piss off.
Well, but the text says because of his guests. I mean, it could really be that it's Herodias.
This is going to be like the coolest ad ever.
Yeah.
I asked him to cut someone's head off
And you
give him a
did.
platter, and
Yeah, it's like, and then he's sort of like feeling like he is at Heartbreakers and he overtipped and now he's regretting it because he really did like John the Baptist. But the other thing about the platter, one of the people at the book study yesterday was telling a story about she was in the military for 8 years, and some of that time she was deployed in Iraq, and I don't know exactly what she did, but at one point she had accompanied her commander to a dinner in, I want to say it was Jordanian folks, but the delicacy was that they, much like we do with the pig roast, they do a goat roast, and they put the whole goat on the table, and you just pick your meat out. And then at the very end, the hosts wanted to honor the commander by sharing with him what's considered to be the biggest delicacy in the goat, which is its eyeball, which they plucked out and handed to him. And I thought, that's probably because in the back of my mind was today, I'm thinking, well, It's not as bad as somebody's head coming to you on a plate, I think. Yes, I don't know. And it did, by the way,
Tastes like chicken.
taste like chicken. That was what he said. Yeah. Which, you know, I asked some people a couple of weeks ago, and they're not the sharpest knives in the drawer, but there were a bunch of seagulls hanging out, and I said, do you suppose that a seagull tastes like chicken? And it just whoop.
Clem Zablocki had that same experience.
Really?
He was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he said, "Oh no, let the co-chair eat it." And the guy looked at him and said, under his breath, says, "What am I the co-chair?" He says, "Since they offered me."
That's a moment when you decide to give a fuck. See. So, anyway, the Herod thing and John the Baptist, it's all, you know, we can get lost in 57 side roads, but in the end, Herod too is confronted with this thing. What ditch am I going to die in? Am I going to, you know, eat a little crow, suffer a little embarrassment, and tell my daughter, you know, I said, or tell my daughter, you can have up to half my kingdom. I did not say that I would kill people for you at your instruction. It comes back to that. What am I going to be all in about? What's going to matter so much that I'm going to have to make a decision to do something? Whether it's to stay or to leave somewhere. When I was about 19, I was dating this prudish girl, and we went to a Harry Chapin concert at what was then the Performing Arts Center. And Harry Chapin made an off-color joke about Marie Osmond, which was really funny, but she insisted we leave. I should have said, well, have fun. But I left with her because that wasn't a ditch I wanted to die in. But at some point in our lives, probably more often than not, we're going to be called upon to make decisions about that boil down to, is this really all that important? And I think for me anyway, one of the most important tools in making that decision is, how do I really feel about this? Because thinking about it can be really deceptive. Thinking about it can lead us to rigid rules, this kind of thing like, oh man, my guests are going to be upset. No, you know, that's a different issue. And I think Mark Hansen in his book is right, that those moments about where we give a fuck call us to look at our values and our beliefs and what really matters. And it's also, I think, maybe the way we see people living out their spirituality most often. Well, that's a bad example. You know, are there places I do or don't want to shop, and what are the reasons? Do I want to order Papa John's pizzas now that he's gone? Back in the day, what about companies that had invested in South Africa during apartheid? In some ways, those economic decisions are too easy. What do I do when I see somebody who obviously needs help and I'm in a rush? The Good Samaritan. What do I do when I could buy something on the cheap, but there's a part of me that knows that it's probably stolen? And I think we all make those decisions at different places on the spectrum. And ultimately, I think, too, being true to ourselves is the most important thing. The Walmart controversy. You know, you shouldn't shop at Walmart because they don't pay their people a living wage. In my first church, they said that a lot. And one day I said, well, I have to tell you, if I didn't shop at Walmart, I'd be standing in front of you naked, which is a situation none of us would enjoy. So, you know, sometimes it's easy to say those things when you can afford to shop anywhere you want.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
You know.
But if I can't afford the organic bananas,
Right. Right. Which for some reason are always extra brown. I don't know if that's because nobody buys them and they sit around longer. But I noticed that at Pick and Save this morning. It's like, man, those do not look good. And what about this idea with Walmart-like things that if I boycott this store, yeah, those people aren't being paid a living wage, but they won't have any wage if we effectively boycott that store. So then what do we do? What should I do about my brother's wife? Should I tell her she really needs to get Philip to grant her a divorce, or what the hell?
It's interesting that on the one hand you have the example of Herod, who obviously was too attached to people's opinions of him, and the counter you could notice was that John actually gave the ultimate example of detachment. Gotcha.
Well, and I thought about going at it from the John side too. How much are we going to push our particular views on another person? I mean, he could have said to Herod, look, here's the deal. You really shouldn't marry your brother's wife, especially while they're still married to each other. But obviously, he ended up in prison, so he continued to push at Herod too much. The Columbine question. If somebody holds a gun at your head and says, do you believe in Jesus Christ? Do you say yes and get your head blown off, or do you believe in a God who's saying, what are you thinking? You have a life to live. It's that too. John could have stayed out of that position by just choosing that not to be the ditch that he ended up dying in. And for some of us, obviously for John, I hope, that was right where he needed to be. Some of us would have gone, whoa. And that's part of making those choices too, which aren't at all easy.